Glad you're along for this short little broadcast on YouTube. We're just excited to be able to give you an opportunity to listen to a little bit of what we do here at Cherokee. We just hope that you enjoy this, that it's a blessing to you. And feel free to leave a comment. Feel free to get in touch with our church via the website, www.cherokeechurch.org. From our website, you can listen to entire unedited messages. And if you're in our listening audience, you can tune in to 103.5 FM for Truth for Today that plays every Sunday morning at 8:30. God bless.
How great is our God.
Separate ourselves from things that are holding us back to sharing the gospel and being involved in what God has for us in our lives every day. But I want you to see a very interesting thing, because we've established that Paul is free. We've established that he has distanced himself and stepped back from any indebtedness that he would have to anything in this world. That he's not indebted to any person or any government or anything, that he has pulled himself back from anything that would cause him to be indebted to anything in this world. And I want you to see what the next thing that he does is, because this is pretty phenomenal and it speaks deeply to who Paul is. It says, verse 19, "For though I am free from all men," here it is, "I have made myself a servant to all." Even though he is at the peak of freedom, he has all the freedom in the world, he makes a choice to be a servant to all men. He says, I could be free, I could be doing what I wanted to do. He could have done the same thing that he did in traveling around the world and never preached the gospel. He could have went here, made a few tents, earned enough dollars, went and had a good time, picked up, moved to the next place, make a few tents, go have a good time some other place. He could have lived a party life, if you will. But he decided that he wanted to make himself a servant to all men. He made a choice to serve other people. He made a choice to be under someone when he was truly free. That's a pretty phenomenal place to be, I believe. We have to recognize, and this is one of those passages of Scriptures that a lot of people have twisted. That a lot of people have pulled out of context and have manipulated it into what they want it to say and changed it into something that they want to hear to make them more comfortable, maybe with their lives or their family's life or whatnot. And we have to remember that Paul's message did not change, but his methods did. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. But we have to recognize that this passage of Scriptures, when he says that he made himself a servant to all men, it is not saying that he accepted sin of all people or he started involving himself in the same sin as those people. But the idea is that he changed his method or the way that he approached people with the gospel so that they could understand. Excuse me, I gave the example in the first service. Last summer, I believe it was last summer, I was filling pulpits. And I've been getting quite a few calls, and I got a call to go to Lawton. I don't know if you all know where Lawton is. It's out on 69 Highway. It's a little tiny town. We actually went to church there for a year or so. So I have the freedom to say there's, I think, 23 people in the town and 34 stray dogs. But anyway, I love Lawton. They're the very first church that gave me the opportunity to come and fill the pulpit, and so I'm forever grateful to them to trust me to do that. But anyway, I went there, and I don't even remember what the sermon was that I was preaching. But I was preaching this sermon, and I used a farming analogy. I used an analogy about, and I can't even remember what it was, if it had something to do with plowing the ground or reaping a harvest or something. But I used farming as an analogy for the sermon. And probably at least 90% of the people that go to church in Lawton farm for a living. And so as I was saying that, everyone in there is doing this. I'm getting amens and yep, buddy, and I know. I mean, they're in unison almost. They knew exactly what I was talking about. And a couple of weeks after that, I got a call from the pastor at Trinity in Pittsburgh. And I said, sure, I'll go to the second biggest church in our association. I'd love to preach. So I'm there. So I went and I preached the same sermon because I was really feeling it. I felt like I was on a roll and it was going good. It went well in Lawton and I was like, man, I've got this, baby. So I went and I was preaching that sermon. I'm going and I get to that analogy and just start going in about this farming thing. And I got the blankest looks you've ever seen in your entire life. These people are staring at me like, what are you talking about? And I realized, and at that moment, literally at that moment in that sermon, I realized that I needed to grow. I realized that I needed to be able to change my method but keep my message the same. I needed to recognize who I was talking to. It's not that those people are not smart. They just weren't farmers. They never plowed a field. They never ran a comp. They didn't know what I was talking about. They were businessmen and laborers and things like that, and people who lived in town. It wasn't that they were less smart or anything. It's just that they didn't have the same knowledge and the same understanding. And that's what Paul is saying when he says that I made myself a servant to all men. He says that I reached out to each person in their own individual way, in a way that they could understand, in a way that they could grasp what I was saying. The same sermon doesn't work. The same message doesn't work for each person. And I recognized that day that I needed to change my method while keeping my message the same. And I believe that that's what Paul is saying here. I don't want anybody to leave saying or thinking that we need to compromise, our values, or compromise what the Bible says about right and wrong and sin, because that's not the case. Sin is still sin. Right is still right. The gospel is still the gospel. But how we portray the gospel to people and how we get it where they can understand it and put it on their level. We don't teach theology in children's church, okay? We teach them simple things because they're children. And so that's what he's saying. So we see that Paul has made life choices to make himself free from all men. And then it's allowed him to preach and to teach in a way that each person can understand. But I want you to see one more thing in this first point before we move on. And it was his motivation for doing it. And this is pretty amazing. It says in verse 19 at the very end, it says, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. That I might win the more. You know what? I don't think that winning the more is always the attitude that I have in my life, and I don't believe that it's always the attitude that we, as maybe not this church, but as the global church, has. Many times in my life, I've been passive. And many times, whenever I've wanted to share the gospel or portray the gospel to someone, I've just decided that whoever God puts in front of me, that's who's going to hear it. And if they see me acting like a Christian, my actions speak louder than words. And if I go to work, and if I don't say a cuss word all night, and if I go to work and I act like a good Christian, then they're going to see me and somebody might get saved. And if somebody does, then that's good enough. And the Apostle Paul says, the ones that are easy, that's not enough. I want to win the more. You see, we could go on and we could have church the same way every single Sunday, do the same thing every single Sunday, and there would be some people that would come into this church and accept Christ as their Savior. We would baptize some people. We could do it the same way. I could preach the same sermon every Sunday for 2 months, and somebody eventually would accept Christ. But that's not good enough. Because Paul says we must win the more. That we must not be satisfied with the ones that are easy. We must not be satisfied with the ones that just come in contact. We must seek out. We must make ourselves all things to all men. We must meet them where they're at. We must go to them. We must show them that we love them. If we stand around and if we wait for someone to come running into these doors, folks, the door hinges aren't going to get wore out. We must be a people who make ourselves all things to all men. We must be a church and a local body who want to win the more, who are not satisfied with some or with a few. Paul wasn't trying to win the more for his glory, for his edification. He wanted to win the more because he recognized that it was the call that God had put on his life and had put on every single Christian's life. And he wanted to win the more because he recognized that they needed it. That there was groups of people that were dying and going to hell every day because they needed it. So the first thing that we see is that he was free from all men. The second thing we see in verses 20 to 22. Let's read those. It says, And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win the Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without the law, as without law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all things, all means, save some. If first of all he was free from all men, the second thing is that he was all things to all men. And he gives us 3 examples of how he was all things to all men. He starts out in verse number 20 with the Jews. He starts out to saying that to the Jews I made myself a Jew. And I find it very interesting that he says that I made myself as a Jew, because he was one. He was born into the Jewish lineage. He was a Jew. And yet he says that I made myself as one, which speaks to his freedom.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to our short little broadcast here on YouTube. We hope that it's been a blessing for you.
See how great